In the West, we are a deeply unhappy society. Which is strange because given the lives we lead on paper, you would think we'd all be jumping for joy. We have electricity and running water in our homes. We have access to the internet, flush toilets. As someone who, when I was in the Marines, spent a lot of time without flush toilets, having to share a latrine with 60 other men, or having to dig a hole in the ground to do my business while mosquitoes bit at my nether regions, I can tell you, you cannot have too many flush toilets. That said, even the toilets can't make us happy. Our cell phones, we have devices in our pockets that allow us to order food and have it delivered directly to our house. We don't even have to pick it up anymore. And yet we're all unhappy. The things I mentioned just now, 20, 30 years ago, were only available to the rich and famous. 150 years ago, they didn't even exist. We should be the happiest, most joyful people in the world. And yet, rates of anxiety and depression are through the roof. Loneliness is higher than it's ever been before. There's a new trend on social media called rotting, which from the best I can tell is able-bodied young people choosing to lie in bed for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Some of them film themselves while they do it. Something is terribly wrong. And I would propose that the issue is our addiction to pleasure. As a society, we have access to so many pleasurable things, so many sensory inputs. But sensory inputs cannot make us happy. Imagine, if you will, if I put a plate of chocolate cake in front of you, and you love chocolate cake, for the purposes of this example. The first bite of chocolate cake is incredible. Your tongue sends pleasure signals to your brain. Your mouth waters, your eyes roll in the back of your head. It's the best cake you've ever had. By the fifth bite, more or less the same. By the 15th bite, even though you still enjoy chocolate cake, it's not as good. By 50 bites, you're basically done. By 100 bites, you don't even want to look at it anymore. What I just described is called the hedonic treadmill. And simply put, the more we get of a thing as human beings, the less we want it. The problem and the cause of all of our suffering is that instead of looking at the thing and saying, enough, we tell ourselves just one more bite. The 5th bite of chocolate cake wasn't that great. The 20th bite wasn't good, but that 25th bite, this time it'll be different. So what ends up happening is we get more and more and more of a thing, and it satisfies us less and less and less. The more sensual pleasures we enjoy, the more unhappy we become. And as a society that has access to every pleasure under the sun, it's a given that the more we feed our addiction to pleasure, the worse our mental and spiritual health will become. Now, what's good about our situation is that it's not just us that experience this. This is the human condition. It was true now. It was true 2,600 years ago in the time of the Buddha. Remember, he was a prince. Not only was he a prince, but he was the prince of a very powerful king, slated to become a world-turning monarch. He had a stern but loving father that made sure he didn't want for anything. His stepmother was very kind. He had access to every pleasure known to man. People were literally not allowed to tell him no. I assume the Buddha ate the equivalent of a lot of chocolate cake in his day. And yet he too realized that this addiction to pleasure would not make him happy, so much so that eventually he left the palace in order to pursue the spiritual path, to find a way to end all sorrow, not just for him, but for all sentient beings. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. You see, when the Buddha, on the night he decided to leave, he met up with his charioteer, Chandaka. Now, it should be understood that the person who drove the chariot back in that day was also the de facto bodyguard, which makes sense. If someone's going to drive you around the kingdom, they need to be able to handle themselves in case you're attacked by bandits. No one spent more time with the Buddha in his youth. As such, Chandaka was also probably a close advisor and maybe even a friend of the young prince. So naturally, not wanting to be blamed for the son of the king leaving the kingdom, Chandaka tried to talk him out of pursuing the spiritual path. We can read exactly what he said in the Lalita Vistara Sutra, which I have here. And Chandaka made his case in the following way. O best of men, this kingdom is yours, flourishing, extensive, prosperous. These delightful gardens, these parks, this palace, built like Mount Vajrayanta. The women's quarters are yours, where the women know so well how to mix concerts of songs and instruments with dance and enjoyment. Enjoy these pleasures. Do not wander forth as a monk, O excellent one. Now, what's interesting about this, and we'll get to the Buddha's response in a moment, is that as a young man, I can remember getting very similar advice. I wasn't a prince, obviously, but I remember leaving home and all of the older men in my family telling me, live it up, have fun, make mistakes, get drunk. And I also experienced what the Buddha experienced, which is that those sensual pleasures are very fun in the moment, but they lead to long-lasting consequences that aren't so enjoyable. What's also interesting to me, and I think this speaks a lot about our society and where we're heading, is that what I found is that no one worries about you if you tell them you went on a bender over the weekend. Drugs and alcohol, okay. No one gets too concerned if you tell them that you spent all night playing video games or scanning social media. That's completely normal. But the moment you say you want to engage in a spiritual path, the moment you say that you went on a meditative retreat over the weekend, that you put an altar together and it's in your living room, that you've been reading sutras and you're starting to think differently, now everyone is concerned, much like Chandaka was for the Buddha. And the reason for this concern is that, again, our society is addicted to pleasure. And because of this addiction, all of this pleasure seeking and the suffering that comes with it, we assume that is normal. It's expected. That's what you're supposed to do. Trying to find a way to fix it? Now that's just weird. Here's the Buddha's response to his good friend. As son of the highest of kings, I ruled over a great kingdom, composed of the 4 continents. I was then a Kavartan king, in possession of the 7 precious objects. Living within the women's apartments, I have ruled over the masters of the Tridasa realm, of the Suyama gods. After passing from their midst, I became the highest among the Nirmitas, holiest of the gods of transformation. I have already enjoyed the greatest prosperities, which could delight the heart. I'll say that again. I have already enjoyed the greatest prosperities, which could delight the heart. I have had the power of the greatest of gods and mastery of their realm, and I was not satisfied. what I really love about the speech that the Buddha gives in this moment is that it's not a moralizing speech. He's not saying that, Chandaka, you're wrong and you're a bad person and pleasure seeking is wrong, and if you do these things then bad things will happen to you. It's not a triumph, it's a surrender. He's giving up. In this life, in his past lives, the Buddha has engaged in everything the world told him would make him happy. He tried it all. Now he's going to try spirituality. And I think as Buddhists, we have all come to this same realization. Maybe it's not to this extent, but we've all had this situation where we have the nice car. We got the promotion at work. We had that number in our head that we wanted to hit in our bank account, and we hit it. We planted the flowers in the flower bed. We bought the house. We have the picket fence. Everything on the list that's supposed to make us happy is ours. And we're not happy. Like the Buddha, we are not satisfied because pleasure seeking cannot satisfy us. It's not possible. If we truly want a satisfying, fulfilling experience, we have to do something else. We have to pursue spirituality. This is why the meditating, the chanting, the sutra study, the prostrations are so important. Because what they do is they remove the greed, anger, and ignorance from our mind, the defilements that cause us to feed our addiction to pleasure. And as we remove those defilements, we're able to engage in other practices that are healthy and life-affirming. What I've personally found that the things that are most satisfying aren't necessarily pleasurable. I get great satisfaction from working in my garden. There's nothing that feels better than planting seeds in the earth and watching food grow. But is it a pleasurable experience? Does it feel good in the same way that sitting on the couch and watching a movie feels good? No. In fact, it's very unpleasurable sometimes. You get bitten by bugs, the sun is hot, you're crawling around in the dirt. But it's satisfying. It's life-affirming. When I think about caring for my animals, and I love my animals, but again, it's not always pleasurable. It's cold and it's rainy and you're walking around with feed buckets and you're sliding in the mud. Pleasure is nowhere to be found, but the satisfaction we receive from seeing that our animals are safe and well cared for, you can't put a price on that. So what I would like to gently encourage you to do is follow in the Buddha's example. Practice your spirituality. Engage with the Dharma, with the meditating, the chanting, the sutra study. Let go of the pleasure seeking. If you found, like the Buddha did, that it's unsatisfying, try something else. And after you do that, that will give you the fuel, the spiritual motivation to try other things that aren't necessarily pleasurable, but they're satisfying. Maybe that's sweeping the floors, maybe that's washing the dishes, maybe it's volunteering with a nonprofit. Whatever it is, I promise you, once we give up our addiction to pleasure, happiness is much easier to find. Amitabha.